All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Jamie and I would like to thank you for joining the third of our three-part Heritage Support Grants Program webinars. Today's presentation will take a closer look at logic models, go over the project budget, and provide more information about the cash match. We're very pleased that you've joined us today. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and remind you how you can participate in today's session. This will sound familiar if you've participated in one of our webinars before. As a reminder, you should see your attendee dashboard on your computer desktop in the upper right corner. You've joined today's webinar listening through your computer speaker system by default. If you'd like to call in using the phone, just locate your audio pane and select Use Telephone. The dial-in information and access code will then be displayed. You have the ability to ask questions using your questions pane. Just type in your question and click Send. We'll do a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but I'll be monitoring questions as they come in. Look for a follow-up email from us tomorrow. It'll provide access to the recorded webinar and a link to complete a participant survey. I want to thank you in advance for completing the survey. We use your input and your feedback to improve our workshops and webinars. Does anybody have any questions right now? All right. We're going to do our first poll question before I turn things over to the amazing and wonderful Jamie Semick.
Okay, hi everyone, this is Jamie, and I think you can see the results there from the poll. So it looks like we have a few folks that are practicing with those logic models, and a few who are, I'm sure, very anxious to get started on using those. So we are definitely going to talk about that this afternoon. All right. This is my contact information. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome, and we're glad to have you. And if you've been with us for parts 1 or 2 of the webinar series, then welcome back. But again, here's my contact information. I'm going to show this to you again at the end of the webinar, but this is my email address and then also my Twitter handle if you happen to be on Twitter and would like to follow me. And so again, we'll go over this contact information at the end, and I'll also give you contact information for some of my colleagues. So a little bit about what we're going to go over today. Again, we're going to talk about that logic model. We are definitely going to be talking about that 15% cash match for the project grants. We are going to go into detail about project budgets. You can let me know if any of these concepts are unfamiliar, and we'll make sure to describe those a little bit more, and then we're definitely going to answer all of your questions. So as Tamara said, if you have questions and you want to just go ahead and type those in and get those answered, we can use your questions box there. We've got a couple of spots where we'll take pause and do questions as well, but Tamara's going to be monitoring that, so feel free to put your questions in whenever you think of them. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so we're going to start off today talking about those logic models. Don't worry if you've never used a logic model, or even if you really haven't even heard of them before, but we are going to go over them in detail. And if you want more practice using logic models, I would also recommend attending either our in-person pitching your project or making your case workshops, and I'll give you some dates for some of those upcoming workshops towards the end of the webinar. So this is a logic model template. There are different ways to approach logic models, and templates vary a little bit, but generally they are all made up of the 6 sections you see here: objectives, inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. The sections on the top make up what we call planned work, and the bottom section is intended results. And you can see at the bottom under outputs, outcomes, and impact that there's also a space for you to note how you will track and measure these things. I have uploaded a logic model template for you to use in the documents section. And so I think whoops, excuse me. All right, I think you should see it, hopefully. So if not, I'll send that to you by email. We can get that attached to you. No problem. Okay, let's go back to the screen here. Alrighty, so this is the logic model template. We also have this on the Heritage Support Grants website. I will show you at the end where that is so that you can locate that and you can print off as many copies as you need. Now this is what we call the simplified logic model, maybe a little bit of comic relief before we get too serious here. You know, as grant applicants, it's easy to wish that we could use this argument, right? But the fact is that funders need more info. They need to understand the organization's needs. They need to understand what we want to accomplish to meet that need, how we're going to implement the solution, what kind of results we're expecting, and really what difference it's going to make. So it's difficult to articulate all this information. It does take a little bit of practice to get comfortable using a logic model, but it's actually a really powerful tool that can help you sort out the answers to all of these questions. Logic models can serve as a guide to help you think through your programs and describe them in a way that will help you build your case for support. Now, sometimes when we're talking about logic models, we use the if-then statements. It kind of just helps us think through things. So let's start at the top. If we have a problem or a need, then we're going to want to develop some specific solutions or objectives. And if we want to meet these objectives, then we're going to need to provide some resources or inputs. And then if we have all these resources, then we're going to be able to implement some specific activities. All of these are necessary steps to determine what our planned work is going to be. So then we get into our intended results. If we undertake those project activities, then we're going to expect some type of goods, services, products, situations to come out of them. These are outputs. And if we get these outputs, then we expect to realize some benefits and changes, which are called outcomes. And if we realize these outcomes, then we can expect to see some longer-term changes, which is impact. So let's look at each of these a little closer using an example. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's just say we've decided that we need to expand our education outreach program and highlight what we're doing with family history programs. So education outreach and family history. Those are the two things we want to focus on. That's our need. It's not necessarily a problem in this case. It's really more of an opportunity. And you may find that you know, your project proposals are addressing opportunities rather than problems, and that's fine too. Okay, so we started at the top there with objectives. You may have heard the saying, begin with the end in mind, and that definitely applies to grant applications. As you're building your case, you have to be clear from the very beginning exactly what it is you aim to accomplish. So, if we want to expand our education outreach using our family history programs, for example, then we're going to need to define exactly what we want to achieve. We need an objective. Grant reviewers want to understand exactly what an organization will do with the funding they're requesting. You may have heard of the term SMART objectives before. To the extent that you can, try to make your objectives specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and timed. So let's look at a possible objective here from our example. So in order to expand our current public education and family history initiatives, we will host 4 quarterly half-day beginners genealogy workshops for youth ages 8 to 12 starting in May 2017. So let's say that's the objective for our proposal. In this example, we are pretty clear about what we want to do. We're specific. Half-day beginning genealogy workshops, kids ages 8 to 12. This is also a measurable objective because we've set how many workshops we want to host. We could make it even more measurable by giving a target number of participants for each workshop or the total outreach that we plan to do for the year. The objective is actionable. It's something we can achieve with funding because we're going to prove that we have all the other pieces in place to make this happen. And we're going to talk about our capacity to do this by providing examples of the resources that we bring to the table. Certainly this objective is also relevant as it does directly address the need we've established. And it's also timed because we provided a start date and have spaced our workshops out to happen quarterly. So next we're going to want to look at our inputs. These are the resources we're going to need to direct towards the work we're going to want to do. And so it's important to note here that these resources can be things that we currently have, or they could be resources that are going to be purchased with grant funding. And they come in a lot of different forms, including, as you see here, human, technological, organizational, community, material. There's probably others that you could think of. So from our example, if we want to offer genealogical workshops for kids, some of our inputs might be including volunteer genealogists. We're going to need experts to help lead this. We might need computers to access the genealogical databases. We will need classroom space for the workshop. We might be talking about our partnership with local schools or the 4-H office to promote the program. I'm sure you can think of a lot of others that would be resources going towards this project. But as you can probably see, those inputs are closely related to the activity that we plan to implement. So you're going to take those inputs or resources and use them to implement the program or the project activity. The activity will be defined by the inputs you have to put towards it. And conversely, your list of needed resources is going to be informed by the activities you plan to include. Whether we're talking about an educational program like a genealogical workshop, a masonry project for your building, or a collections catalog project, the processes, actions, or interventions that make up those activities are what are going to lead to the changes or results. So activities from our example might include making a family history workbook for the kids to use, compiling genealogical resource take-home handout, marketing our program, registering participants, and of course actually hosting the workshop. Those are all examples of activities that would be associated with our proposed project. Now, we do talk a lot about outputs and outcomes because these are the results of the project. That's what comes out on the other end of the activities. So when considering outputs, remember that outputs address the question, what will we do? Outputs are tangible results. When we get our outputs, we know the project is finished because we will have the products of our project in hand. And these are often things that can be observed, counted, tallied. From our example, these could be successful workshops, participants, new educational materials developed, staff and volunteer time, among many others. In other projects, it could be collections objects rehoused, it could be photographs digitized, it could even be a watertight building or a functioning HVAC system. Outputs are important to evaluation. It's good to determine upfront which outputs you're going to track and why. So if outputs address what will we do, then outcomes answer the question, what difference will we make? This is what I like to call the big so what. We talk a lot about outcomes here because they really set up the desired end state that we're seeking. within the confines of our project because these are the short-term changes we're hoping to see. When thinking about your project outcomes, think about learning that will occur, behaviors that will change, and lives that will improve. Again, if outputs tell us that a project is finished, outcomes are how we determine if it was successful. So from our example, our outputs could be that participants are going to learn how to conduct family research using primary sources and other resources so that they may continue to add cited evidence-based information to their own family histories. It could be that children and their families will be introduced to the museum services and resources for further family and local history research needs. Or the museum will establish new relationships with local educators, opening doors to future programming opportunities to introduce local history to families in the community. To take each of these a step further, we're going to set up measurements. What will success look like? It may be through a follow-up survey or an advanced workshop offering, by tracking kids using reference material in the museum, or by new educational outreach programs developed. But all of these are examples of outcomes. Now, the next step after outcomes is impact. This is a long-term change that's going to be realized across an organization, community, or system, and you may not see the impact by the time your project is over. And while impact is more difficult to measure, it's still important to understand the big picture results you're hoping to achieve. So in our project, those might include more youth involved in local and family history, increased visitation and involvement with future museum programs, or increased interest in and dedication to preservation and access of primary source documents. I already mentioned the big so what. These are his friends, why and how. So as you're working on your grant proposal, and particularly your logic model and the corresponding project logic section of the application, keep these three questions in mind. So what, why, and how. Just keep asking yourself these questions in each section and make sure you've answered them. I can tell you that when I'm helping organizations by reviewing grant applications, or when some of my colleagues are coaching their organizations, a lot of the questions they have as they're going through it have to do with so what, why, and how. So just make sure you keep those in your mind. Okay, so we've made it through the logic model section. Before we move on to talk about the money side of things, do we have any questions about the logic models?
I'm not seeing any questions right now, Jamie, but remember, you can ask questions anytime, and we'll work to get them answered for you.
Okay, great. Well, as you start to work on your logic model, remember that it is a tool. There is no absolute right or wrong way to do it. Really, just use it in a manner that is most helpful to you. And I would recommend doing your first, maybe second and third drafts in pencil, because you may find yourself doing some erasing or moving things around, and that's completely fine. Also, feel free to move back and forth between the different sections of the template. You don't have to do it in a completely forward linear fashion. You can hop around if that's how it makes the most sense to you. Okay, let's do another poll. So I'm going to launch this one for you, and you can all just give me your responses. I would like to know, how does fundraising fit into your work? Whether you're a volunteer with your organization or you're a staff member, how does fundraising fit into the work that you do? Okay. Give it a few more seconds here. Okay, so it looks like we're about 50-50. on that, so I'll let you take a look at that. About 50-50 on whether it's something that you do as part of your work or whether it's not necessarily part of your job, but it looks like if you're going to possibly be doing some grant writing, maybe it could be something that you could contribute to, so that's great. Alrighty, so let's hide that, and we are going to move on to budgets. We're going to talk a little bit about fundraising when we get into that cash match section, but let's talk about the budgets first. So we covered organization budgets a little during part 2 of the webinar series when we went through the grant application section, but let's go over it just a little bit again. We do require that you attach your organization's annual budget, but this can come in whatever form your board has approved for the organization's use. You don't have to have a specific template or report for this annual budget. If your organization doesn't currently have an annual budget, this is something that you're going to want to discuss with your coach. It's a required document, so she is going to work with you to figure out how to develop that budget. And we do have a few different reasons for requiring your annual budget. First and foremost, it helps reviewers better understand your organization. It really does speak to your financial solvency, and it helps reviewers put your project into perspective in terms of how it fits into your overall operations. So that's why we ask for those organizational budgets. Okay, as promised. Last week, I told you we were going to spend a little bit more time on project budgets today. So we're going to look at the required project budget template again in just a little bit, but generally, your project budget is going to be a line item account of expenses and income. Now, we do like to say that a good budget is detailed, tracked, and changed. So what I mean by this is that it's detailed enough to provide that needed information for grant reviewers, but also for your project team. So this may include using descriptions, providing unit numbers and prices, or even detailed information like specific item numbers or colors. When I say tracked and changed, I'm specifically talking about how you use your budget during your project if your grant is successfully funded. Ideally, you'll submit your budget numbers, which are really just estimates, and then as you incur each expense through the course of your project, you'll update the budget with those actual numbers. Finally, we realize that sometimes budgets change. Sometimes things don't go the way you anticipated, whether good or bad, and you do end up having to reallocate some funds. If your grant is funded and you find yourself in this situation, please work with your coach. Any changes over 10% of your total grant will require a formal request for reallocation, but again, that's something your coach can help you with down the road. For the application, you need to know that your budget can only include direct costs. It cannot include indirect costs, overhead, facilities administration expenses such as utilities or salaries for permanent staff. So let's look at the budget template again. This is our Heritage Support Grants budget template. You are required to use this template to submit your project grant. This ensures that all applicants use the same form and include the same information, which makes it easier for our reviewers. You can download this Excel file from the HSG website under that resources page. And you will notice here that there are 3 different sections: income, expenses, and balance. So let's look at income first. In this section, you are going to include all money coming in for this project. First and foremost, on the first line, you're going to want to include your Heritage Support Grants request. Put your request in the budgeted column that's highlighted there in green. You'll notice that the template has some formulas built in and will automatically calculate a 15% match on the next line. If you're applying for a project grant, you'll know this is your cash match amount. If you're applying for a mini grant, you can just delete the formula from this cell as you don't have a cash match requirement. In the other lines under the income section, you're going to include any other sources of income, including money you already have in hand as well as any other fundraising you still need to do. Your total income amount should equal your total expense amount. So let's talk about the expense section next. This is where you're going to list your anticipated expenses by line item. Again, at this point, you're only using that budgeted column. Leave the actual column blank until you make the purchase and know the actual amount. And at this point, don't worry about the differences column at all. This column has some formulas that are going to cause the numbers to add and subtract. Just ignore that column right now. What you do want to pay attention to is that balance section at the bottom. We're looking for a projected balance of 0. In other words, as I said, your expenses and your income for the project should be exactly the same. Let me say just a word here about contingency funds. There are some projects that can reasonably include a 5 to 10% contingency or just-in-case funds. This is especially true of some building projects or those that are weather dependent. If you're not sure whether you should include contingency funds in your expenses, this is a great question to ask your coach. Okay, the budget justification. This section of your grant application should correspond with that project budget. This is your chance to explain your expenses in enough detail to justify including them in the project. The budget template includes a spot for notes, but the budget justification is where you should provide most of the details about your income and expenses. You can also use it to show how calculations were made. I'll show you an example on the next slide. 2 tips for the budget justification section. First, make sure that it follows the same order as your itemized budget template. And second, make sure that everything in the budget template, the budget justification, and the proposal all match up. Double check that the numbers are the same throughout. There are a lot of different ways to approach the budget justification. On this slide, I've provided examples for personnel, equipment, and materials and supplies. One thing we like to mention when it comes to budgeting for personnel. So if you've got a project that you're thinking of that involves bringing somebody in to do some work for you. Organizations do and can bring in temporary employees or contractors or consultants with grant funds. Depending on which you use, though, you may or may not be responsible for that person's payroll taxes. We don't give advice about whether or not somebody should be classified as a temporary employee or a contractor. What we do is encourage organizations to discuss this with your tax attorney or your accountant to determine which classification is correct. This is not a choice at the employer's discretion, but is determined by the IRS and Department of Labor guidelines. So if you bring on a temporary employee for this project, you're going to need to budget for those required payroll taxes as well. So that's just something that we like to make sure that folks are aware of as they go into their budget. And as I mentioned last week, there are a lot of examples online if you want to see additional budget justifications. So just do an internet search, and I'll let you know that sometimes it's also called a budget narrative. So that's something else that you can look at. Okay, next we're going to talk about that cash match. The project grant does require a 15% cash match. If this is not your first webinar, you've heard me say that a few times. We do want this money to come from new fundraising, and it needs to be in actual dollars. It can't come from in-kind donations, such as use of space, for example, and it can't come from cost sharing. An example of cost sharing would be to calculate the percentage of time a staff member is going to devote to this project and then allocate the value of that salary as a cost share. So that's an example of cost sharing. The 15% match is calculated in addition, sorry, I should have changed that slide for you. The cash match is calculated in addition to your total grant request. In other words, if you're requesting $20,000, your cash match would be $3,000, so that your project total from the grant and the cash match would be $23,000. So that's something to keep in mind as you're working on that budget and trying to figure out what your ask should be and figuring your 15% match, 15% cash match into it. Okay. The funds you raise need to be designated from this project, and again, like I said, should come from new fundraising. They should not come from the organization's general or rainy day funds. You really do have an extended timeline in which to secure your cash match, though. You can start fundraising up to 4 months before the summary of proposal deadline, before that very first deadline for the project grant, and you have until the end of your grant cycle. So if you're awarded a grant, you have all the way through those 12 months to secure your cash match. And we will want sources documenting how you got your match in your final report. So make sure to keep track of that. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of different sources of funding. These possible sources of funding have a lot of variables depending on the overall cost of your project, whether it's phased, what your current donor base looks like, what level of community support for the project do you have, and also your opportunities to secure other grants. Many organizations undertake project-specific fund drives by mailing appeals to their donors or including the community in a big public campaign. Other organizations have a few donors who are willing to provide their individual support to a project in the form of what might be considered a major gift. Some organizations host special events or designate that funds raised at a recurring annual event be used for the project. Still, other organizations are able to secure additional grants and can sometimes even leverage a Heritage Support Grant to receive additional funding through a matching grant. Community foundations can be important partners in the local grant-making process and really can serve as a vital resource for information as well as funding. So do make sure you're in contact with your community foundation. As you decide how to approach the cash match, look closely at each option to make sure you and your board have a very clear picture of each. First consider the steps necessary for each option and for any that aren't listed here. Are there any relationships that are already in place? Do you already have lines of communication open? Does the organization have the resources available to launch this particular method? What other considerations are at play? And finally, what are the pros and cons of each approach? It may take some thought and good communication to decide which of these is the right fundraising strategy. Some organizations are definitely further along with their fundraising than others, and that's okay. If you're looking to take your fundraising to the next level, then I would love to invite you to attend one of our fundraising basics workshops that are going to be coming up in the next few months. And in addition, you can always contact me or your coach to talk about fundraising options. Okay, believe it or not, that brings us to the end of our Heritage Support Grants webinar series. So does anybody have any questions about the material we covered today, or even questions that you've thought of about material that we covered in previous webinars? Okay, well, we do hope to have the recorded webinars available on the Heritage Support Grants website under the resources page in the next month or so. In addition, all attendees will receive a copy of the recorded webinar in their follow-up email that will go out tomorrow. So I did mention that we have some upcoming fundraising for local history workshops. These workshops are free, and you can register for them on our website, where you can find all of our upcoming local history services trainings. Offerings for June through December of 2007 will be in our next issue of our Involved brochure. So if you don't get the Involved brochure from us, just send me an email and we'll make sure you get added to the mailing list. But I'll point out there, I mentioned I think all of these except the evaluating your outcomes But the Pitching Your Project is here at IHS. We use the morning to go over some frequently asked questions and some tips. And then we spend the afternoon with the coaches, just one-on-one. We provide computer access, so it's a great time if you're in the midst of a grant to come and just work with your coach. The fundraising basics, we've got 4 different dates there coming up to almost next month, and then 2 later on in the fall. And we really just look at all kinds of fundraising, but really focus on individual fundraising and just kind of getting your fundraising platform up and going. And then in August, we're going to be doing the Making Your Case for Grants. This one is grant specific, but not necessarily specific just to our grant program. So if you're going to be looking at other grants in addition to the Heritage Support Grants, it's just nice, a nice source of information and tips. And then we do have the Evaluating Your Outcomes webinar that we'll do in December. That is the same format as these webinars we've been doing, and we talk specifically about evaluating during your project and what kinds of things to track and how to report on it. And I did mention that I would show you again the website. indianahistory.org/grants is the place to go to get information about the grants program. You'll notice there on the right-hand side at the bottom is that resources page I keep talking about. So that's where you can find copies of the grant applications. That's where you can get the budget template. That's where you can get the logic model template. So that resources page is definitely someplace to stop by and take a look around. Okay, and then this is the same slide, the same contact information for the 3 of us that are on the grant administration team. Tamara can talk to you about general inquiries. I'm happy to talk to you about workshops, training, coaching, and then Kurt Barsick is our grant program manager who can take all of your online grant portal inquiries. So feel free to contact us at any point if you have any questions or need more information. And we certainly appreciate you taking time today and during the last 2 Thursdays before this to learn more about the Heritage Support Grants program. And we really hope you'll enjoy participating in future training opportunities as well. So I don't see any questions. Tamara, am I missing anything, or does anyone need anything?
Nope, there aren't any questions, and I want to add my thanks to Jamie's for all of you spending time with us the past few Thursdays.
All right, great. Well, then, like I said, get in contact with us if you find you have questions later, and we will be happy to talk to you about that. And thank you again for spending a little bit of time with us this afternoon, and have a great week.